The Hill reports Zelensky's number 2 visits D.C. as U.S. warns Ukraine funds remain running dry. The Biden administration and Ukrainian officials are issuing urgent appeals for Congress to provide military aid for Ukraine, with the White House saying the pot of funding is running dangerously low. This while Sputnik International reports CIA chief says that Ukraine's visit linked to looming palace coup against Zelensky. International Affairs and Security Analyst Mark Shloboda said CIA Director Burns would either tamp down the civil war or tell Zelensky to go quietly. For insight into this, let's turn to our first guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Boers Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital: Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. He is Dr. Gerald Horne. As always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, in a sign of how acute the threat is, Ukrainian President Zelensky dispatched his number 2 official to Washington this week for meetings at the White House and on Capitol Hill, pleading for aid requested by the president to be approved and delivered. Quote, "We know how to achieve victory," Andrea Yermak, head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, said during a speech at the Hudson Institute earlier the week. Meanwhile, we need weapons now. A couple of things, Dr. Horne. One, we know how to achieve victory. Well, you, as the tuna said, you are what your record says you are. And so if you know how to achieve victory, why you been getting your hind parts whooped all of this time? And you need weapons right now. Well, what's happened to all the weapons that you've gotten up to? Oh, they've basically all been either blown up or can now be found on the black market. What's going on here, Dr. Gerald Horne?
On the black market in historic Palestine, in fact, to the point where Israel apparently is complaining about Hamas having anti-tank missiles that somehow made their way from Ukraine to historic Palestine. In fact, some comics have suggested that it would be more efficient for the United States to ship the weapons directly to Hamas. And that kind of bizarre comedy shows where we're at right now. Now, understand why there's this threat or there's this prospect of a palace coup, because it's playing out, quite frankly, in the pages of the North Atlantic press. I'm sure you saw the Washington Post a few days ago, where the Zelensky crowd have suggested that those who helped to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline approximately a year or so ago were actually comrades of the generals in Kiev with whom he is feuding. This was apparent payback for an article in The Economist just before that, speaking of the British neoconservative weekly, in which one of Mr. Zelensky's leading generals suggested that there was a stalemate on the battlefield, which is code for saying, as you put it rather prosaically, that the Ukrainians are getting their butts whipped. And then, before that, in Time magazine, you saw that staff of Mr. Zelensky suggested that he's delusional and that somehow this TV comic actor styles himself as Napoleon Bonaparte, reimagined. I guess he might have gotten a sneak preview of the new Ridley Scott movie starring Joaquin Phoenix, and he's countermanding the orders of his generals who are much more experienced. Now, sadly and unfortunately, Washington is caught up in this comic opera. The rather unsteady Senate Minority Leader, speaking of Mitch McConnell, who specializes in freezing for inordinate periods before cameras, is now in a kind of de facto Cold War with members of its caucus who do not want to authorize more spending on this rather ridiculous escapade in Ukraine. In fact, the new bill that has just been signed or will be signed by President Biden, engineered by the MAGA speaker, Michael Johnson, contains no spending for Ukraine, no new spending. And then this civil war, this Cold War in the Republican caucus is reflected all over YouTube. I'm sure you gentlemen in particular are familiar with the frequent appearances of Colonel McGregor, the former Trump aide, who regularly questions, if not denounces, Kiev. Judge Napolitano, the former Fox News commentator, ditto. Larry Johnson, the former CIA analyst, ditto. And of course, Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky is not necessarily enthusiastic about this continuation of the Ukraine comic opera himself. And then there is what this portends for NATO. Ann Applebaum, the neoconservative scribe, has suggested this is do or die for NATO. They're going to have to find a way to turn this impending defeat around. She suggests, if not implies, that otherwise NATO will be headed for the dustbin of history, which, by the way, you may recall, was something that President Macron of France intimated some months ago, but he said that NATO was brain dead. This was, of course, before the special military operation of February 2022. And we understand why there are these rather mordant comments about the future of NATO, because as we speak, President Erdogan of Turkey, is in Berlin. And it's no secret that there is another kind of Cold War and Civil War unfolding on that battlefront. The president of Turkey has been unsparing in his denunciation of Israel, unsparing in his praise for Hamas, who he considers to be freedom fighters. This has not gone down very well in Berlin. Berlin has little alternative but to invite him, since a large part of the working class happens to be of Turkish origin. And as well, I should point out that in recent days in Turkey, there have been massive demonstrations in favor of a ceasefire in historic Palestine, which, as you know, is not necessarily being recommended by the White House. More than that, there have been significant demonstrations at the NATO base in Turkey, which features a complement of U.S. servicemen. If Washington is not careful, they will find that not only will their personnel illegally in Syria, but also in Iraq and elsewhere in the region, come under attack in Turkey, which by some measures has the second most powerful military behind the United States in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And a footnote here, I'm sure you're following the travail of the scandal-plagued mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, on these allegations that he's been receiving under the table money from Turkish interests. Recall that just a few days ago, the federal authorities stopped him on the streets of Lower Manhattan and pushed away his security and took his iPad and cell phone. Now, I'm not sufficiently naive to be a coincidence theorist to suggest that it is coincidence that there's troubles with Turkey, and then there's these problems with Eric Adams, particularly since we have reason to suspect that just like there might be an impending prosecution of Eric Adams, some of his Turkish friends may also be spending quality time in courtrooms as well. If that happens, the relationship between Ankara and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization will head further south. And I thought that they had hit the bottom after Turkey had helped to sponsor the Azerbaijan overthrow, if you like, of Nagorno-Karabakh, this supposed Armenian region, which Azerbaijan just swept through weeks ago. This was after Armenia had the ill-advised counsel to snuggle up closer to Washington and move away from Moscow, which didn't make any sense, and this was the inevitable result. This did not win. That is to say, this Azerbaijan triumph did not win Turkey many friends in France, which has been a long-standing ally of Armenia. And then we all know that Ukraine, as already suggested, is not high on the priority list in Capitol Hill. Israel has taken its place not only with regard to headlines, but with regard to funding. And with this rather difficult meeting between Mr. Biden and President Xi outside of San Francisco yesterday, we can expect more U.S. military materiel to be flooding into Taiwan as well, pushing Ukraine further down the list. And speaking of Biden and Xi, I'm sure you were taken by that standing ovation that President Xi Jinping received from the 1% in San Francisco yesterday. A crowd that included Tim Cook of Apple, a crowd that included Ray Dalio, a major hedge fund billionaire. And I'm not sure if that bodes well for U.S. foreign policy, which is now stuck in this rather bizarre dilemma of having to borrow from the People's Bank of China in order to finance a undermining of the People's Republic of China by dint of this interference in Taiwanese internal affairs. And so we see that Ukraine is understandably nervous as it gets pushed further down the list of priorities. We see as well that those who are thinking that the EU may be able to step in where Uncle Sam has failed, they need to think again because the EU economy is sinking slowly. Germany, the erstwhile locomotive of the EU economy, is suffering because it was forced to turn away from cheap natural gas from Russia. And that helps to explain why CIA Director William Burns, who in many ways is de facto Secretary of State, I'm not sure what Anthony Blinken does besides grimace when Mr. Biden, as he did yesterday, calls Xi a dictator. That's why William Burns, there's so many Burns, William Burns is now in Kiev trying to clean up that mess or perhaps push further down the road this expected palace coup.
A group of Palestinian Americans on Thursday urged a federal court to issue a preliminary injunction barring the Biden administration from providing any additional weaponry or diplomatic support to the Israeli military as it carries out mass atrocities in Gaza. We also see that there were people protesting in front of the DNC the other night that were promptly beaten by police. That was led by the Jewish Voices for Peace. We also see there's same things going on in Canada, and we see significant backlash from internal groups within the Biden administration at the State Department, USAID, et cetera. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, not only that, but I'm sure you paid attention to what happened on the West Coast of the United States just a few days ago when protesters at the ports of Tacoma and Oakland were seeking to stop U.S. ships supposedly bound for Israel with military materiel from departing. This was highly significant. I'm sure you're familiar with the referral being made to the International Criminal Court in The Hague by Algeria and Colombia, the latter being a former ally of Washington, targeting Mr. Netanyahu and his cronies and comrades, who, by the way, have been engaging in increasingly overheated rhetoric. I'm sure you saw the article in the New York Times yesterday by Mark Landler, where the Israeli officials are quoted as calling Palestinian animals. Sarah Netanyahu, the spouse of the prime minister, said that was an insult to animals. The talk about dropping a nuclear bomb on Gaza. This is purely reminiscent, I'm afraid to say, of the kind of overheated rhetoric that was used in the spring of 1994 before the Rwanda genocide. And that's why I salute the Center for Constitutional Rights, the public interest law firm in New York, by complimenting the referral by Algeria and Colombia by filing a suit seeking to ensure that the U.S. administration adheres to the Genocide Convention. If the U.S. administration ignores that suit, or given the state of the right-wing court somehow is able to prevail, hopefully that will just be more grist for the mill for the ICC, which can rescue its tattered reputation for simply going after leaders in Africa. The U.S. administration, not to mention their comrades at Foggy Bottom, across the river at the Pentagon, Langley, Virginia, et cetera, need to realize that they are aiders and abettors and accomplices of genocide. And in a fair and just world, they will be forced to walk the plank as well, or minimally consult lawyers before deciding to travel to certain jurisdictions, because I'm sure you saw the article about how France is seeking to invoke universal jurisdiction to arrest the president of Syria. Well, what's sauce for the goose, sauce for the gander. Let's say that Algeria or Colombia can invoke universal jurisdiction to arrest a visiting U.S. diplomat, for example. So we are in the middle of a global crisis. The world is basically facing a fork in the road. Down one road, obviously, lies genocide, lies continuing Israeli depredations. Down another road, perhaps we are experiencing the birth pangs of a new international order where U.S. imperialism and its moth-eaten, rules-based international order, where they make the rules and give the orders, becomes emptied into the dustbin of history.
I was watching, I think it was MSNBC, Wednesday evening, and they were interviewing a guy who's a member of the Israeli Knesset, and he was explaining this latest proposal and the anger of the occupying government, the Zionist government in occupied Palestine, that more countries aren't taking Palestinian refugees. And he was angry at Egypt, and he was angry at another number of other countries, talking about how important it is for them to allow these quote unquote displaced Palestinians to resettle. And what that said to me was, oh, so really what you're doing is you're just admitting to the world that all of this is a land grab, that you're trying to turn Gaza into rubble so that you can acquire that Mediterranean beachfront property that you want to build on. And what also got my attention is how often the Zionist government just tells on itself. It has admitted clearly that this is retribution, that this is collective punishment. It has admitted in a number of instances that it's committing war crimes, but that all of that does not seem to sway the dominant opinion. Your thoughts?
Does not sway the dominant opinion, indeed. And that brings us to that unfortunate demonstration in Washington just the other day, where the press reported that there were 290,000 folks in this pro-Israel rally. My sources tell me it was closer to 15,000. So once again, we are going to have a talking to with the corporate media. But more than that, there was the appearance on the platform of naked anti-Semites, such as these so-called Christian Zionists, as they dubbed themselves. We saw the shouting down of the black CNN commentator Van Jones after he called for peace and was drowned out by cries of no ceasefire. And with regard to these Israeli authorities telling on themselves, keep in mind that there might be something even more diabolical involved than gaining that treasured beachfront property in Gaza on the Mediterranean. There is the prospect of doing a double play on Cairo. That is to say, building a so-called Ben Gurion Canal, as it has been dubbed, through that territory that would challenge the Suez Canal, which brings billions to the government in Cairo, and that would be payback for Cairo not playing ball in terms of opening up the Sinai Desert so that thousands, or perhaps millions of Palestinians can be dumped there. And Israel, once again, is playing with fire. It's simultaneously dragging down itself, but also dragging down U.S. imperialism with it. And that brings us, of course, to the powerless nature of the Israeli economy, which is seizing up, which has to spend millions daily on this conflict, which apparently has no strategy beyond killing civilians. You saw the story about supposedly they discovered a stairway leading to tunnels and a hospital. Well, then the question becomes, why don't you go down the stairway and fight the Hamas folks and take back these so-called hostages or detainees?
In fact, that's a question. That's a question that we have for our next guest. Is we've seen pictures of this tunnel. You've shown us pictures of these weapons. How come we're not seeing GoPro film footage of you all in the tunnels, kicking butt and taking names?
Well, that is the $64 question. But it's no secret that the Israeli military is held together by chewing gum and
a shoestring.
Exactly. That their draftees and conscripts who are not known for being able to go toe-to-toe, they're much more capable, that is to say, the Israeli military, in terms of dropping bombs from 30,000 feet on civilians, or that army of draftees and conscripts are much more able to break arms of Palestinian teenagers. And so Israel faces a real crisis right now, which brings us to the book written some years ago by the investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, Samson's Option, where he said that rather than go down solely, that Israel would try to bring down the entire temple. Perhaps that's what the plan is, to trigger World War III, or at least bring down, for example, neighboring regimes in Cairo, or, for example, reference the bombing just a few hours ago of Damascus.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.